A very good evening, a warm welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, brought to you by Norman Goodfellows, and welcome to the natural riot that is suburban Athens. Now, you can doubtless hear in the background that chorus of what sounds like some rather overexcited crickets. They're actually titiria or cicada, and those are residents of the garden of my parents-in-law's home in Athens. I am a month with the family in Greece, which gives me the chance both to see the family, but also to explore some of the wines of Greece. If you remember the shows from last August, and there were plenty thereof, the wine of Greece is something that has not only improved dramatically, but rocketed up to become, along with South Africa, my favorite wine country in the world at the moment. Whites that are layered and textured and interesting and exciting, and red wines that are, well, they're a lot better than they used to be. My first encounter, my first skirmish with Greek red wine just over a decade ago was forgettable. Now the red wines of Greece, wines that really take advantage of the terroir, the grapes that are natural to Greece, and as a result deliver wines that are lighter in style, that have elegance, that have perfume, that have a real attraction to them. Wines that I think, along the lines of a Heliotico and Mavro, we're going to start seeing pop up as people like Ibn Sadi transfer Greek history into parts of South Africa, like the Swartland, where conditions are not dissimilar, and thus the potential lies to turn Greek magic into South African magic as well. And so during the course of this month, on and off, in between catching up with South Africans, I'll be chatting to a few Greek winemakers, seeing how things have progressed since last year, and perhaps getting a clue as to what wine we could be seeing out of South African vineyards in the next 10, 15, 20 years as we borrow some Hellenic expertise and send it our way. It's not Greek wine on the cards today, though, although as Greece is a country with a love of history, it is a big chunk of South African heritage that makes this a particularly apt show as we kick off my time in Greece, and in particular here in Athens. I spent this morning wandering around the Acropolis and some of the older corners of the Athenian capital, and although those go back a little longer than our guest state today, it is still one that's got a rich history and has become a really important part of South African wine, a global icon in terms of South African production. And I say that very deliberately because it's a wine that can be found all over the world, but also has an army of fans across the globe. That wine is Meerlust, headlined by the Rubicon, although it's an estate that offers more than just its trademark Bordeaux blend. There's also the Meerlust Red, which began almost as a secondary wine, but has found its way into very much its own space. And so Wim Truder, the winemaker, will be with us, telling us about the history of Meerlust, his history with Meerlust, explaining just why the wine has done so well over the years and why the newest vintage is particularly special. So all that coming up on Dan Really Likes Wine with Norman Goodfellows. Before we catch up with Wim, though, let's have a quick look at the latest wine news. All right, this is a celebration of Backsburg. Now, I'm a shameless fan of Backsburg, given it's the estate I was married in back in 2011. And this is the chance to celebrate Women's Month with the Elitage Rosé. Elitage be a great name for a wine. Backsburg's having a lot of fun. There's been a lot of change of late. You might not have seen Backsburg in the last little while, in which case that label might look a little odd, given what you are used to. But now, as part of the DGB stable, lots of injection of support and resources, and some really exciting winemakers across the DGB stable. And Alicia Rachner, there in picture, is very much one of those. And this is the Pinotage Rosé. And there are a number of people doing Pinotage Rosé at the moment. The light, very pale style of rosé that has become de rigueur in South Africa, which I particularly like, is seen in this instance a slightly darker version. It's given the Pinotage grape that has been used. It gives it a wine with a little bit more weight, a little bit more bounce. But Pinotage turns out surprisingly good as a rosé, and one that sits really nicely with food with a little more substance. And that is a Backsburg celebration. So look out for that. You'll find it in Norman Goodfellows, and it's your chance to drink some rosé with a little more heft from Backsburg in celebration of Women's Month. Now, this is a Strauss & Co. auction. This is on at the moment. It closes next Monday evening. And the heritage part is the important part. There's a lot of wine here that is going back a fair whack. You'll see the GS66 in the picture. There's also some GS68. There is some, we can still call it port then, some port from South Africa, KWV, going back to 1948. I think there's some stuff from the 1920s. There is a Constantia port from 1791. If you're feeling flush, a whole range of Van de Constance as per the image. Some whiskies as well, and that Mortlach is a very special one. But if you're looking for wine, there's quite a bit of stuff from 1973 on the auction. So if this year is your 50th birthday, then it'll be a good one for you to go and look out for and make an appropriate purchase to celebrate a rather special year. And then the Beast, 10 Dime Torero, was with him earlier last week. This is a 2016 Shiraz Cabernet Sauvignon, a very much an Australian celebrated style, but one that has been interpreted very happily and very lustily by the team at Holden Mats, Sherrod Holden and 10 Dime Torero, both big rugby-loving men who like their wine in a similar style. And this is one that, if you buy it from Norman Goodfellows, you'll go into a draw, and there's a case of wine signed by Tendai himself. A very special one will be coming your way if you are the lucky winner, and all you need to do is either head online or get into one of the Norman Goodfellows stores, buy yourself that case, and you could be the very lucky winner. Okay, well, I sadly can't win that, given that it's my competition, but I can drink some rather nice wine. And I've got some of it here, headlined by some 2016 Rubicon, so going back just a little. I smuggled some South African wine. I didn't smuggle it. It's perfectly legal to bring it in. I bought some South African wine in with me. And most of the wine I bought is of a fairly more substantial nature. It's bigger Bordeaux blends, Cabernet Sauvignon, some fine Stellenbosch wine. And there's a reason for that. Well, actually, there are two. Firstly, it's just really good wine. But also, it is a welcome counterpoint to a lot of the wine that I'll be getting here in Greece over the next 3-4 weeks, where the red wine in particular is from that lighter, more elegant style. You're not getting the wines that have the muscle and the presence and the body of some of the big Stellenbosch style reds or similar. And I'm also finding in South Africa at the moment, a lot of wine is coming into the Dan Really Likes Wine cellar. Samples being said that is lighter, that's more delicate. It's not losing anything in terms of the flavor profile, but it maybe doesn't have quite as much presence as some of those bigger wines. And it's nice to keep a bit of balance, to have a bit of both. Some perfect for a warm summer's day, others sitting around the fire, and it looks like it's still a bit chilly in South Africa, where you need something to warm you up from the inside. And that's a style of wine that Meerlust have nailed when it comes to red. The Rubicon, the Cabernet Sauvignon, they do an excellent Merlot that I don't think gets nearly enough acclaim or indulgence. Maybe tonight can help shift that. And so we thought we would look back at the Meerlust story today, look at the success of Rubicon, and gee, it has been a huge success, and find out just how tough it is for the winemaker to keep this style, to make the best out of it, and how the Meerlust Red comes into play as well. So Wim Truter, a winemaker, cellar master at Meerlust, a warm welcome to the show. Lovely to have you here from what I suspect is a slightly cooler Stellenbosch than it is here in Athens. Well, welcome. Lovely to have you on the show, and welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine.
Good evening, Dan. Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. Very envious of the weather on that side, but the sun is finally shining down in the Cape, so we're drying out, so it's all going good.
And you have some lovely wine to keep you company, which will put a smile on your face, as it will be on mine and my family's this evening, because it's a brand that I think the Nickel household has a very similar appreciation for to so many South African households, where Meerlust Rubicon is just such a benchmark of South African wine, and such a staple of so many homes on big occasions, so many wine lists sitting at the top end as a real guarantee of quality and enjoyment. And it stems from a number of years of getting this just right. Take us back to the very beginning, to a guy who sounds like he could have been either a member of the Italian mafia or perhaps a Juventus centre forward, and how the Meerlust story began, and from there, this Rubicon that's become such a South African favourite.
Yeah, no, very true. I think it's one of the things that stand out when I present the tasting. The number of consumers that walk up and just tell me, listen, you need to listen to my Rubicon or my Meerlust story. It's incredible how this brand has been part of your weddings and special occasions. It's just incredible. But yeah, going back, I think, Hannes, who currently is the proprietor of the estate. He's the eighth generation. So the previous generation, his father, Liku, they actually spent some time in Bordeaux in the 70s. And on the return, they decided that this property is just ideally suited, given the soil's proximity to the ocean, to producing a wine, and a flagship wine that's actually a red blend. And come around 1978, they had a young winemaker, George de la Cia, who was actually on loan to the estate. And they came up with the first concept, the first blend of in proportions of Cab Dominant, Merlot, and Cabernet Franc. And that first blend was actually bottled. A couple of samples were distributed, and feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Came 1979, they actually did not actually make any wines on the estate. And then 1980 was the first vintage where they actually made a commercial offering. So the wine was blended. A very famous story of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon River, speaking the word to die as fast. There's no real going back. Once you've blended the wine, there's no unblending it. And that first wine was bottled, and really history was made at that stage. As a young wine, it won every competition on the local scene, and I guess the rest is history.
The history of the wine is substantial enough, but if you look at the history of the estate and the Myburgh family, am I right? Hannes is now the eighth generation Myburgh, who's been looking after a estate that goes back, it's about the 1700s?
Yeah, so the original farm was granted to the first owner, Henning Hissing, in 1693, and the Myburgh family acquired it in 1756. So a very rich history.
And it's one that's now translated into this extraordinary wine. When the Rubicon was first made, I'm sure you've had a chance to chat to the de la Cia, to chat to your predecessors there. What it's become now is just extraordinary for its success around the world. Was there any inkling that this wine was going to be as good as it became, was going to be as successful as it became when it was first started?
Well, I think the first vintage was received incredibly well. Like I said, it won actually the trophy for Young Best Wine in 1980. I think if you look at the uniqueness of this area, it really does lend itself to it. I mean, hindsight is 2020, but I think in terms of the initial commitment to quality, it really sort of predicted that the success is going to be there. If we look at their commitment in the first vintage, 1985, alluding to the red earlier, if a vintage does not live up to the absolute quality criteria that we set ourselves, the wine is actually declassified. It's not that bottled as Rubicon. And I think that commitment to quality has always given the consumer the guarantee that they're really going to be getting something very, very unique. Really is a representation of this unique estate. And I think that commitment to quality is one of the main features that makes consumers always come back to the wine.
That's a big thing to do, to declassify a wine. I imagine that if you make that decision, you've got accountants in tears as their bottom line falls through the floor. So you've got to really believe in your long-term vision for this wine to say, you know what, this isn't quite good enough. This is going to take a step down. It's not a small decision to make.
Absolutely. I think, but you're quite right when you said that it's a long-term strategic view of the brand. It's something that I really appreciate since joining, is that it is really all about the longevity of the brand and our focus on quality and what this property means to the people. And it's no short-term gains. If we are not convinced that lives up to the quality, it does not go into a Rubicon bottle. And I think
you will have tried some of those wines that have been declassified. When you pick them, are you able to go straight away? Now you know that the brand well enough. Go, yep, I can see why that's not quite up to the level it should be.
Well, I think if you look at the last 40 plus years, and if you look at the vintages that have been declassified, they're normally characterized by quite severe and intense weather, climatic conditions. for us being very close to the ocean, we're literally 5.5 kilometers from False Bay. Got the southeaster coming in having a massive impact, and we've got it's a quite a cool area in the Stellenbosch context with late ripening varieties. If we are faced with a season with a lot of unseasonal rains in Feb and March, it does become problematic. And those are sort of normally the years that are sort of typified by having that declassification, because it's a vintage where we believe that we get not the full ripeness that we really require to make the Rubicon blend. So what I quite often find is that it's less just about absolute quality, but it is really a different stylistic expression as well. The red vintages are normally lighter, a bit more aromatic, more red fruit based, tannin slightly easier to manage, a bit more approachable in youth, where the Rubicon vintages obviously is really typified by that deep intensity, dark fruit, and that structure.
Which suggests there is definitely a pattern to Rubicon. There's a set of boundaries within which it is made. How strictly is that applied? How much does a vintage have to, if not exactly replicate, then certainly occupy a pretty similar space to previous vintages, particularly given you've got this global army of fans who have a certain level of expectation?
Yeah, I think you rightly said that expectation weighs quite heavily on our shoulders. Like I said, you do a tasting at a consumer event, and you've got people coming up explaining a wine that was made 40 years ago and what meaning it had to be. So there's definitely this commitment from our side to actually uphold that quality level. I think what we've seen in terms of what we know from the climate, what we know about the rainfall patterns, there's a certain level of prediction. But I think from a winemaking point of view and from a viticultural point of view, we're quite happy to say that there's no recipes going into a season. It really is about understanding your vineyards, understanding the vintage, interpreting what's going on, and how that transpires in the winemaking side as well, tasting, evaluating on a daily basis, adjusting accordingly. I think we've got a stylistic outcome in mind and an obvious quality outcome in mind, but the inputs surrounding that are variable, and it's about managing that.
I often think one of the toughest jobs in wine is the non-vintage champagne makers of the big houses in France, who have to consistently get every year a Veuve Clicquot or a Moutet Chandon right time and time again. You're not trying to mirror things quite so exactly, and not having a recipe is, I think, very important, particularly given vintages shift from year to year. But how difficult is it for a winemaker, even for someone with the scientific and chemistry background that you have from around the world, to get those different pieces of the puzzle to work and know what you have to tweak, what you have to change to try and get that similarity coming through year in, year out?
I think it all really starts with what we're faced with in the vineyard side. And I think from that point of view, we are in a very unique position. I think this is a forgiving farm in the sense that it's got this variety that find expression naturally here. It's beautifully suited to Merlots and Cabernets. Like I said, in terms of temperature, we are easily 5 degrees cooler than the rest of Stellenbosch, just because of the prevalence of the ocean and the wind factor. So that gives us quite a big buffering potential. And I think it's also quite unique. You mentioned now the non-vintage champagne, and that's actually the art of blending and putting all these 100 components together. And I think that's where the magic is the fact that our flagship is multi-varietal blend. We do get to play around with these varieties and the contribution they make. So like I said, we've got a very clear stylistic and quality point that we aim for in terms of the Rubicon as a final product. And we get to play with these varieties and their expression within a vintage to get to that stylistic and quality point. So it might be a very strong Merlot year that we've seen, like, for example, in the previous vintage and also in 2020. And we get the dark fruit and the expression from there, because the later ripening Cabernets are slightly lighter in those vintages. Or, for example, 2023, which seems to us at the moment for us being an exceptional Cabernet year, and a slightly lighter Merlot expression. And getting that balance and getting that blending done, it really is where a lot of the magic is.
I should know and understand more about this than I do, having been on the periphery of the wine industry for so long. But I've got to be honest with him, half the time it seems like witchcraft to me that you guys are able to taste the grape and sniff the terroir and work out, right, I need 11% Petit Verdot this year. How do you manage that? How quickly does it come to you where straight away you have this idea, oh, hang on, this year, this is what's going to dominate. This is what I'm going to need a bit more, a bit less of. How naturally does that process come?
Yeah, I think we don't want to make it sound too easy because it definitely isn't. I think at the end of the day, it really starts again in the vineyard, and the blend to a certain extent gets defined by the property and the vineyards we actually have planted. So a lot of forethought has gone into the planning of the structure of which vineyards are going into the ground, and so the size of those plantings, because that, in a sense, determines the components you have to play around with. Then on the blending table itself, like I said, you need to have a very clear idea of to what you're working towards. And luckily, with something like the Rubicon, that reference has been there for 4 decades. We have a very clear idea of the fruit profile, the ageability of the wines that we're aiming at. And you get to play around with these different components, but it's also not a one-time event. You get to play with these components all the way through fermentation as they're going through malolactic. You get to know them intimately when they're in maturation, tasting the different barrel lots. So when we get to the point where we're actually blending, we've worked with this trial blend and the composition for a couple of months before we get to a final point in time.
Grant Saul's watching the show at the moment. There are not many wines Grant doesn't own, so no surprise. He's got some Rubicon. One of my favorite wines, says Grant. I enjoyed a 92 and a 94 a few weeks ago. Was still drinking well. 09 vintage, also an all-time favorite. Now, I know there's a vintage coming up that you hold in particularly high regard, Vin. Before I ask you about that, though, let's just get a little bit of your story leading into Meerlust, because I know you've studied all over the place, a lot of time in Europe, learning not just the wine craft, but a bit of science thrown in as well. What was the wine story that, first of all, got you into the broader industry and then led you to Meerlust?
Well, I mean, my father worked in the wine industry. He worked for the Stell. My first holiday job was scrubbing floors in the cellar. And I think it really is one of those jobs where, initially, I don't think you really understand and know what you're getting into, like I guess most jobs. I was always, really interested in the science and biology part of it. And I think as it opens up to you and you get to experience the people in the industry, I would say the surrounding activities, the food, the wine, the pairing, the culture around it, you just fall in love with it, and it just really grows on you. And it's an industry where it really offers you the opportunity as a young winemaker to pack your bags and get on a plane and you travel the world, work vintages all around the world, get to experience new places, new people, new cultures. It's just magic. So I was very privileged to be able to do that. And that really just instills that love for wine and for the industry, and sort of the relationship and the friends you've made around the world. It's a special industry to work in. I've been lucky enough to travel, studied in France for a while, which was an incredible experience, not just from a technical winemaking point of view, but just again understanding the culture and the love they have for the product and really bringing that home. And I joined Meerlust in 2020, so 2020 vintage, which being now released, is the first vintage that I worked on the farm, which was a bit of a watershed vintage for us as well. It was a tough time globally. We went into lockdowns, a lot of difficult things in the harvest season. For me personally, I was still doing 2 harvests. I was still finishing up with my previous position in KWV. Luckily, we've got an incredible winemaker here, Alpus, in the farm that managed the vintage. And I could come in over weekends and you could taste the vineyards and decide what to pick on a Monday and a Tuesday. So it was a nice, challenging vintage, which really just sort of makes you return to basics and really just focus on what's important.
There must have been 2 sides to your thinking when this opportunity came about. On the one hand, this is amazing. I'm going to take over Meerlust. I'm going to be making Rubicon for a South African winemaker. It doesn't get much better than that. But then on the other hand, oh, geez, I've got to be looking after Rubicon. This is a pretty big task. This is one I can't get wrong. This is not just Meerlust wine. This is South Africa's wine. What was that thought process like when the opportunity arose?
No, absolutely. Yeah. Don't stuff this up. No, definitely. It's a challenge, but I think it's incredible. It's the team that's assembled here. 2020 vintage. Sadly, we lost Rudy Hubert, our very long time farm manager. So there's a lot of people who spent a lot of time really committed to this brand and to this estate. And I think it's a team effort. So I don't walk in here and say, listen, now it's Rubicon and I'm just going to take over. This is not about reinventing the wheel. It really is just about focusing on the legacy of what's been done before me, and so much of the good work, the foundation, the groundwork, this incredible vineyards that are planted on the farm. And like I said, not working in with any preconceived ideas or recipes. We really manage the vintage, we manage the vineyards according to what we see, and just a focus I think that Meerlust has always had is not to try and follow any fads or new styles. It's this focus on elegance and balance, and that's not something that will ever go out of style.
What was, before we look at these vintages you've been overseeing, what was, if you remember, your first experience with Rubicon, your first bottle of Meerlust?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, my father used to work in the wine industry as well, and he actually used to be involved at Baskel in Stellenbosch, where these wines were actually matured. So I remember as a young boy, I remember talking about Meerlust Rubicon, and it's just this famous name, and I couldn't put a face or a name to it, and then following it in the industry and just seeing how it's really epitomizes, I think, the best that we can do. So when the call came and this opportunity came across my road, it was almost a bit surreal. It's just a very privileged position to be in.
So what do the new vintages taste like? What can we expect from the deft hand of Wim Truter? We'll be back in just a moment to find out. In July and August on the Dan Really Likes Wine store with Norman Goodfellows, something very special indeed from the great Peter Allen Finlayson. What have we got?
Dan, we have got 30 cases of the 2018 Cabernet Franc from the Garboskloof Landscape Series.
Oof, I love this wine. I've just had some of the 2021, which is delightful. The 18, another 3 years in bottle, another 3 years aging perfectly. Cabernet Franc, for me, one of the finest grapes we're doing as a single varietal in South Africa at the moment. All yours, only on the Dan Really Likes Wine store with Norman Goodfellows. Jump online, get shopping. There's some really great wine headed your way. So there we go. That's the Dan Really Likes Wine store. That is available. So too, it's some rather nice Rubicon at the moment. If you head over, that's the Dan Really Likes Wine online store with Norman Goodfellows. And there we go. It's wine that is now under new hands starting in 2020. What's been the evolution of the wine under your watch? And in particular, tell me Vim, about one wine that you think is really, really exciting.
Well, like I said, I think we've come from a place where there's this incredible loyal following for the style of the wine and the quality has been made over years. So it was definitely not about reinventing the wheel. It's just really focusing. I think 2020 maybe a bit of a watershed vintage for us as well. New team coming in. We know quality was absolutely a non-negotiable. We had to really focus. So it's a slightly smaller selection for us in 2020 that we bottled. A big focus. This vintage is dedicated, like I said, to our farm manager Rudy, and it's an expression where we're seeing the older vintage, the older planting material, the Merlots are really coming into fruition, making a bigger contribution into the actual Rubicon blend, which is a bit of a first. And then 2020 also marks the first vintage that we're actually going to be releasing the red as a permanent wine on the South African market. In the red has always been reserved only for declassified vintages. But the farm has been on a journey in the last couple of years, and we've been actually replanting quite actively, which is, I think, an incredibly important thing to do. And we've got a lot of young vineyards coming into production. And those young vineyards are actually going to be being bottled now under the red label in normal years as well.
In terms of that style of the red, in the past, it's always been the the Rubicon that wasn't quite there, for want of a better turn of phrase. Will the style change at all? What can we expect from the red now?
I think in the past, as I said, the vintages were sort of characterized by quite severe climatic influences and rainfall most of the time. So you would normally have a slightly earlier pick. So the style of the red has always been slightly lighter than the Rubicon, tannin a bit more approachable, a bit less new oak, a bit more red fruit dominant. And I think going forward, because we're identifying the young vineyards coming into production, where a lot of the focus on those vineyards are still actually, creating the structure of the vine, the trellising system, developing the canopies, and making sure that the vines are healthy. We go in with a slightly earlier pick as well. So from a stylistic point of view, you have a little bit more of that red fruit expression in any case. In terms of how we handle the fruit in the winery as well, slightly lighter extraction, slightly less new oak. So from stylistic point of view, I think you probably have a lot of similarities going forward. I think the real advantage we see is that there's no risk of it being influenced by bad weather conditions. This truly is just young fruit with a beautiful fruit expression. And I think the consumer is going to have something to look forward to.
So if I put on my my wine detective hat, then buy a couple of cases of each, have the red over the next couple of vintages, and save the Rubicon for a little later.
Yeah, I think if you look at the last couple of vintages, we've had some crackers. 2017 has been in 2015 probably before that, and 2017 on the Rubicon side have been incredible vintages. 2021, I think it's looking incredible. And then we've got the two current vintages where, side by side, I think the red is beautifully approachable at the moment already, where the 2020 Rubicon, it's probably only really going to start coming into its own in about 5 to 8 years from now.
You're also a poster estate for the art of keeping it simple in terms of your range. There aren't huge numbers of different wines that you have, which makes it a lot simpler for people getting to know the Meerlust brand. But you are more than just the Rubicon, possibly the one challenge that some of your other wine has. And I think in particular the Cabernet Sauvignon, to a lesser extent the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir, they do have a little bit of a fight on their hands to come out of the Rubicon's shadow, because they are excellent wine. They've just got a fairly well-known big brother.
Yeah, definitely so. I think if we look at the production on the farm, everything is geared essentially towards Rubicon. When we plant a vineyard, when we evaluate the site, it's for the suitability of going into a Rubicon eventually. I think that's what makes unique, for example, a very special vintage we currently have on the Cabernet, for example, is going to be the 2019, because 2019, as you mentioned earlier as well, it's a declassified year for Rubicon. So there's no Rubicon available in 2019. The full vineyard production was bottled as red. So what normally happens is that Rubicon has absolutely first right of refusal for any vineyard. So it's the best of the best selection. So the reality is, in terms of on a normal vintage, the best Cabernet is actually always blended into Rubicon, the same with the Merlot. And then the variety bottling that we normally do under the Cabernet, for example, is the blocks that don't make it into Rubicon. We find this to be the best expression of the variety. Whereas in 2019, because there's no Rubicon, we made the decision that the best Cabernet is actually going to be bottled under the Cabernet single varietal label. So an incredible expression. So it's from one specific block on the farm, on shale, beautiful richness, lovely dark fruit. So in a year where we found that it's actually not such a strong vintage for the Rubicon, for example, it's going to be a magnificent Cabernet year for us.
There you go. That's a piece of great information, a wonderful tip from Vim. 2019, something of a one-off. First choice Cabernet Sauvignon into what generally is a lovely vintage, but it's going to be really, really special. The other wine that I've had, in fact, I think I had some 2012 just a couple of weeks ago, is the Merlot, a grape that we drink a lot of in South Africa, but sometimes in the upper echelons of wine drinking, the nose is somewhat higher in the air. Merlot is looked down upon a little, and yet I think it's also a grape that a number of people do particularly well as a high-end wine, and you guys in particular, you give your Merlot plenty of intensity and plenty of breadth, and it's a wine that also deserves a bit more attention than I think it often gets.
I think unfortunately Merlot is also sometimes a variety that suffers a little bit because of maybe not planted on the best side. Maybe in areas where it struggles a little bit. It's not a variety that likes to experience dry and stress. So for us, Merlot just actually finds an incredible expression on the farm. If we look at the current vintage of Rubicon, it's up to about 46% Merlot in the blend. It's purely just because of the depth and the concentration that it brings. We've got two quite unique sites on the farm. The one is on granite, and the other one is shale, where predominantly the Merlots are planted. And we have this beautiful red fruit expression on the shale and on the granite, this incredible intensity in dark fruit. And we just find that it's not necessarily a wine that we make that's really soft and fruity and easy drinking. It's a wine with a lot of substance, beautiful richness of flavor. And I think it's also a wine that really ages beautifully. It's for me the wine in our portfolio that shows the complexity the earliest. So the Merlot with sort of 4 or 5 years on the bottle is just a wine that has beautiful bottle complexity, and it's just a wine that pairs incredibly well with really rich sort of slow braised or tomato-based dishes.
I'm glad you mentioned the aging. We heard Grant sort of earlier talking about those 92s and 94s. Last Christmas, we had a 5-litre bottle of the 1999. It did not last very long, although that was largely my wife and her sister. Wine that ages into a beautiful, beautiful space. And it's obviously very much part of the approach is make wine that is going to stand that test of time. That's going to be able to, in 10, 15, 20 years and more, still deliver something that's even more magical than when it first started out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think looking back at the vintages, we were privileged to do a vintage collection not too long ago, and we got to taste all the vintages back to the very first 1980, where we still have a couple of bottles left. And it's incredible. I think this golden line that runs through the vintages because of the winemaking approach, obviously on the one side. And like I said, the great thing is that terroir really here speaks louder than any of our really winemaking actions. We've got this beautiful expression from the farm, and it lends itself to it. We always find quite wines that have really beautiful density, great tannin, but really nice focused length, really nice low pHs that are really beneficial to the aging. We've got quite a big oaking regime that plays a role. It gives some additional structure and length to the wines. So it's wines that are essentially normally quite approachable in youth, not overtly fruit forward, but maybe a bit more reserved. And it really just benefits from that bit of aging, where it just starts developing a bit more that bottle character, a bit of that cigar box and pencil shavings. I think it makes it really interesting. So it's really a rewarding wine if you can hang on to it for long enough.
Well, we have a diminishing collection sitting in the Dan Really Likes Wine cellar of 1978 Meerlust Cabernet Sauvignon. I was able to get hold of a couple of cases in an auction a while back, and both my wife and I born in 1978. I think then we probably had 7 or 8 of those bottles on birthdays over the last 7 or 8 years, and every single one of them has been in perfect condition and a real treat. So you have my firm endorsement on the aging ability. I must ask you before we look ahead to what is to come on the one other wine that sits as something of an anachronism amongst this blur of red wines, and that's your Chardonnay. It's a fabulous wine, and it's one that's been drunk very often by me. What's the thinking in terms of having the Chardonnay? Is it, well, we need an extra dimension to our portfolio, or is it that the Meerlust terroir just really lends itself to making something quite special?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think when I started, it was exactly my mind is the same. It's this absolute Bordeaux blend focused, and then we go and do the 2 Burgundies. And getting to know the terroir, it really is about finding the best possible expression on the farm. And I think we've got that freedom. So the property itself, it's more than 250 hectares, and we only have about 80 hectares planted. And it really is about evaluating each site on its own merits and defining what should be the best expression here. So the Chardonnay, we've got, like I said earlier, we've got these 2 spots, one on shale and one on granite. So the lower lying areas of granite and right next to the Eerste River, it's planted to Chardonnay, and we've got 3 blocks on the shale. And it's just an incredible expression of the variety. We have a really nice stone fruit apricot richness from the granite, and the blocks on the shale, a lovely freshness, lime, citrus expression, lovely length, and the combination of the blocks together is just this really balanced, multi-dimensional Chardonnay. You ferment everything in French oak, and I think it's again it's finding a balance between freshness, length, a wine that's beautiful as just a wine by the glass outside on the veranda on a beautiful day like today, or a wine that has that substance and that concentration and pairs beautifully with food as well.
Also, a wine that can definitely age more than just a couple of years. So next time you do some Meerlust shopping at Norman Goodfellows, think of adding a couple of bottles of the Chardonnay to your collection. What about going forward, Vim? Let's start with where you stand. I've asked a number of winemakers when they kind of feel like they've got their head around a new space, when they've taken on an estate or a new cellar. Many of them speak of about 3 vintages to really get stuck in and a feel for it. Is that about right for you at Meerlust?
I think so. I think so. You know, I think given what we went through with the whole COVID pandemic, I think for us personally, if you could speak of advantages of it all, but you know, we had to stay at home, and you know, I've got a young son at home, spending a lot more time at home, and for essentially the first 2 years, there was no traveling, only spent time on the farm. I think it gave us a lot of time for a bit of introspection, just really evaluating with a very critical eye the vineyards, the plantings, the direction we're taking with each block. And in fact, we actually went through a process in 2021 where we actually pulled out a lot of vineyards that we felt that are not going to be contributing to the quality and the stylistic expression that we require. And we're actually now on quite an aggressive replanting schedule. There's a lot of, with my predecessor, big plantings of Cabernet that's already been started, and we're focusing now getting a bit of new clonal material in on Cabernet Franc, planting some new Chardonnay. We've got an additional 7 hectares of Merlot going into the ground during this season, and we've got some more Cabernet going in on the granitic soils as well. So we're quite bullish in terms of the future. You know, we're reinvesting in the brand, planting vineyards, all contributing to the future of the brand.
And it's a brand that you have custodianship of as the winemaker, but I would suggest not ownership of, and I don't even extend that to the Myburgh family, because I really feel that this is a brand that South Africans feel that they own. And I know when I'm abroad, there are more South African wines I see now, but for a long stretch, Meerlust Rubicon was one of those South African wines that on an international wine list, I was more likely to see than most others. And when I did see it, there was a burst of pride, because here was a great, iconic South African wine, and I knew anybody who had it was going to be duly impressed because of the quality. Is there a awareness? Is there a shared feeling amongst the Meerlust team that it's more than just Meerlust, that this is really a South African icon, and that it's one that's so important to South African wine around the world?
Absolutely. You know, like we are the custodians, and I think, like I said at the beginning, it's standing at an event, especially a consumer event, and you'd have someone come up and tell them their Meerlust story of a 1985 vintage or 1984 vintage or 1992. It's been such a big part of so many special occasions all around the world. And I think we're in a unique position that we make a wine that I think you can truly say is iconic. And we're making it at a volume that's also available, that goes into distribution all around the world. Because I think that's part of it. It needs to be a wine that's available for people to experience and drink all around the world. And no, we're very privileged. We're very proud of what we're doing, and I think our commitment and focus is there. Is that hopefully that legacy may long continue.
And as a legacy, it's certainly not going anywhere, given the investment that you've made and the commitment that you in particular and the broader Myburgh family have as well. But given this changing world we live in, given the shift of things like climate and terroir, in 15, 20 years' time, would you anticipate the style of Rubicon as this South African showpiece to be pretty much the same?
Wow, I mean, that's a tough one. I think if I can look in my crystal ball and predict what the weather is going to be doing in 20 years' time, it would make a lot of money. I think we're in a unique position. Like I said, from a thematic point of view, we are already actually considerably cooler than, for example, the rest of the producing areas within Stellenbosch, which would probably be to our advantage going forward. Because we're farming varieties that find beautiful expression in the rest of, for example, of the elderberry. So I really think that there is some buffer there. I think sometimes the tough thing with a brand like this is that where's the room for innovation? I think often finding that innovation on the viticultural side. How do we adapt to our pruning techniques? How do we handle irrigation? How do we manage soil moisture? So there's a lot of focus for us in being resilient, looking at cover crops, looking at mulching. So we're quite focused on that as a brand. I think stylistically, I think we are always going to try and focus on this, like I said, balance. We're not chasing over extraction or high alcohol levels. It's finding optimal ripeness at an early stage and just finding an expression that people can enjoy. I think drinkability, yes, ageability and drinkability, I think not necessarily opposites. I think if you have that balance and you have that elegance, you still have that drinkability, even with a wine that has this tannic profile and can age.
It's very clear over the course of the show, but also the course of 4 decades and more, that Rubicon is not just very well established, but is not going anywhere other than up over the next little while. But also that it's in very good and very enthusiastic hands. You follow on from some terrific winemakers, but as one yourself, the Rubicon journey has got a terrific custodian to it. Thank you for sharing both your story and the Meerlust story. Thank you for continuing to share this wonderful South African wine with us, and for introducing to us some great vintages and some great memories of the wine that you've made, and suggestions of the wine still to be made as well. So much appreciated.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for having us. Yeah. It's my predecessor has only been 2 winemakers in the history of the estate, so job satisfaction is luckily not a difficult thing to come by. So I'm in good company, and thank you for the support for all the consumers out there.
All right. Well, looks like we'll be having you on Dan Really Likes Wine from Meerlust for at least the next 20 odd years. We can check in on that climate change in 2 decades and see how right we were. There we go. Pim Schroeder, thank you very, very much indeed. Salamat at Meerlust, joined in 2020, now very firmly leading the team and releasing some brilliant vintages. The newest of them, flying off the shelves really at Norman Goodfellows. But look out, I think the real takeaway from today on top of the Rubicon is that 2019 Cabernet Sauvignon, a declassified year, so the very best of the cab, and a lovely red year on top of that. So one to search out, look for, and add to the cellar. That wraps us up for Dan Really Likes Wine, coming to you from a rather noisy suburban Athens. Thank you for joining us. I'll be back with you on Thursday when the Molyneux and the Cravens are on the show. How do husbands and wives and husbands work together as winemakers? Well, we've got 2 of the best pairs, the Molyneux being one of the biggest names in South African wine, with Andrea and Chris, and then Mick and Janine, the Aussie and the South African, met in Sonoma, been in Stellenbosch since 2011, and are now under that Craven wine label, making some terrific wine themselves. So look out for that on Thursday. And next week, I'll be in the village of Mavromati, drinking some Greek wine, sharing it with some locals, and seeing how things have changed since my last visit here a year ago. For now, keep enjoying South African wine, and I leave you in the company of myself and Tendai Mtawarira to remind you of some terrific Beast Red made by Gerard Holden that comes with the added bonus of a case signed by Beast for one lucky winner if you're buying some of that wine through the month of August at the Dan Really Likes Wine store or through Norman Goodfellows. From Athens, have a lovely rest of your evening wherever you may be. I'll see you back again on Thursday. Goodbye. The brand new wine from Beast, Tendai Mtawarira's collection, is headlined by this: 50% Cab, 50% Syrah, 100% Gerard Holden. Well, who on earth is he? He's actually somebody with a pretty cool story, because not only, like you, does he love wine, but he also played a bit of international rugby, just not quite so much or quite as famously as you did.
Yes, I know that Gerard, is a rugby man, and I think that's where we kind of hit it off. and we got that connection, from the onset. And I think obviously in terms of winemaking, he's a brilliant winemaker with a lot of awards, to back it up. And for me to have him, making this red blend for me is an absolute bonus. We obviously partnered, on making this red blend, and it kind of defines me as an individual. Obviously it's very bold. It's smooth around the edges, and I tend to be like that. When you look at me, you're kind of intimidated because of the boldness, but when you come closer, I'm actually quite a well-polished and gentle, giant. So this wine kind of speaks to that. It speaks to who I am. And there's a story here, when you look at the bottle of wine, the eagle in the front is actually my family crest or my family totem. So it tells the story of who I am and where I come from. So, we just didn't, want to bring out something that doesn't tell a story. So there is a story to this bottle. The back label will also give you a description of what you're going to enjoy when you partake, when you have a glass of this red blend. So yeah, I'm very, honored to be working with Jared Holden, and has become a very close friend as well as obviously business partner. And we want to take this, this wine to the world. That's our vision, to take it globally, and starting off here in South Africa.
Well, if you've had the wine of Holden Mance, you'll know the style of Gerard and his team out of Franschhoek, but you want to get a bottle yourself to see exactly what the beast feels is the wine just for him. And as he says, it's big and it's bold, but it's quite warm and friendly as well, and available now at Norman Goodfellows.